and get this started. It is 5 o'clock, so we appreciate you all that are here this evening joining us. So this is a workshop to discuss the process and procedures of departmental contracts as outlined in the city procurement policy and by Idaho state statute. Who's going first? I'll go. And just kind of, she's coming up. So this obviously came about with the swimming pool change order, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. Maybe it was more of a change of status, change of scope rather than a change order, because it was additional things. That's why it was so expensive. But that's what kind of brought it up, is how, when can people apply for these things, and how do they not lowball it, knowing they're going to come in with a big change order afterwards, and kind of just the, I guess, the codes from that, and just for all of our information. So with that, Raylene, it's your, and we have, I think Councilor Register is joining us via Zoom, so she is on online for that regards, or in that regard. So
awesome. So I just have the purchasing policy, which I have given everybody a copy of, but really pulled the sections that talk about either change orders or the process of modifications. So the first one is under section 3.2, and it talks about the authority of appointed officials to execute contract change orders within the limitations of city policies. There's not necessarily, like, city policies is the $50,000 that comes to city council if it's budgeted, or there's two portions. City policy is if it's budgeted, then it over 50,000 comes to city council, or if it's a multiple year. If it's unbudgeted, then anything comes before city council. So that's kind of our current city policy with regards to any purchases. So and so that's kind of the first set in the purchasing policy that talks about that. There's also procurement standards under 5.1 where it says that the city can perform a cost or price analysis in connection with any procurement, including contract modifications. And it says, but will usually be performed with respect to any procurement action involving a purchase price of $50,000 or more. This method and degree of analysis is dependent on the facts surrounding the particular procurement situation. And so the way I interpreted that is that really for change orders or contract modifications, we really need to make sure that we're changing those if it's more than 50,000 and making sure that the reason why we're changing them makes sense and it doesn't cost the city more money in the long term. So in section 22, there's two parts to contract changes and modifications. There's the approval requirements that says the city must have cost justification supporting each change order it may issue. And then cost restrictions, the cost of any change, modification, change order, or constructive change to a current contract must be allowable within the scope of any applicable grant or cooperative agreement and reasonable for the completion of the project scope. And then also in section 22, it talks about specific changes. A significant change in a contract that causes major deviation from the original purchase of the work or the intended method of the achievement or revision that is so extensive, significant, or cumulative that in effect the contractor is required to perform very different work from the described in the original contract. So that means that we really can't just change the contract if it really is that significant. We really need to do a new contract. That's kind of what that says. And then prohibited contract types. I just wanted to bring this up because a lot of times we see a lot of contracts, and these are ones that we just don't put together. So it's cost plus a percentage of cost contracts, unless there's a maximum price that's specified. A percentage of construction cost contracts are prohibited, and time and materials. And it says time and materials contracts may only be used after a documented determination is made that no other type of contract is suitable. And it also needs a price ceiling on that. So this is what's in policy. A lot of our policies are stricter than state law, which they're allowed to be. So this is kind of specific to purchasing policy, so.
Perfect, awesome. Thanks so much, Counselor Stoddard.
Yeah,
Good
Mr.
question.
Mayor. Raylan, so 32.1,
Factor. So it's not a cost plus the percentages. So usually that's materials times a 10% increase, and that's all you get bid, price for, where the RFP or the change of scope, I believe, was actual costs of what it would cost the contractor for that.
so how would we shore up the problems that we had with the pool, for instance, where the city
So,
shouldn't have to pay anymore, but we are?
And it may be good even for Rob to explain a little bit on that, where it was more of a and what was the difference between the change of
Change of
scope? Because it was, the majority of the cost, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't increase of cost, but it was actually additional building that was done as part of that. That's the reason why it was such a big difference.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And Mr. Stoddard, I'll just give a brief history and then I'm happy to answer any questions you have. So I think some of the confusion was the way that it was presented. The pool project was already underway, and we knew that we were going to be starting shortly on a new bathhouse project. And that was actually presented earlier on to council as kind of a side note on one of the council items for the pool project. And so as we're looking at the bathhouse project, our desire was really to look at using the same contractor, because we didn't want to pay for a different contractor to mobilize in and go through all the time and effort needed to get a different contractor on site where they're going to be working, trying to work alongside of a different contractor. And so our intent was to reuse or continue to use Benetton for that work. And that was labeled as a change order to do the bathhouse, but technically it should have just been a change in scope of work. That's what it should have been labeled as, because a change order has a connotation that something was designed and something maybe wasn't designed correctly, or the contractor didn't know how to read the plans correctly, or something happened where the city had to pay extra money to get something finished. In this case, if we had bid out the bathhouse project, it would have been bid out and we would have been paying that amount anyway. And so I think it was, I think the way it was presented was probably incorrect. There were some change orders that were also added to the contract, and so I just want to be clear on that. And we have been working closely with Benetton Construction, and they have defended every change order, and we've sat there and talked through every single one. They, on a side note, they would love, they're out there working on the project and are happy to provide a tour to any of the council members that are interested in going out there, and they can answer any questions on cost. But the way I think that we avoid this in the future, a lot of our projects are constructed, and they're constructed within budget. And you guys never hear about them again during the course of construction because we don't have these kinds of issues. I think the big issue we ran into on the pool was the location was really a difficult spot for pool construction because of all the old utilities that are out there, and that's what led to many of the change order costs. And then in addition to that, anytime you're working on an existing facility, there's always going to be unknowns that you're dealing with because they're not building everything from new. And in addition to that, I would just add that it's a pool project. We don't do a lot of pool projects, and so there's a little bit of a learning curve just for staff to understand what we need to be looking for on a pool project to make sure that we're accommodating everything. And with those items, I think that's what led the pool project to be in the position it's in now. We are confident with the amount that was asked for at that last council meeting where the budget was approved. We're confident that we're going to come in well under that. We asked for more than we needed just because we wanted to make sure if there was anything else unforeseen that we were going to be able to cover that. But we could easily be a $500,000 under that number, looking at the numbers that we have right here. And so I think that staff, on a staff level, we've learned a lot from this process. When we do street projects and things like that, we're much more comfortable with those types of projects and we know what to look for. This one was a little bit unique, and so I think that's kind of where we ended up in this situation.
I think Councilor Doty made the comment at that meeting, if I remember correctly, that seems like every time we go over on something, on a contract substantially, that all the taxpayers hears is that, they get stuck with the overage again and,
Yeah.
no questions asked. And how do we how do we prevent those things from happening, I guess?
Yeah, and Mr. Mayor, Councilman Stoddard, I totally agree with that. I am a city taxpayer as well, and so my taxes are going to this pool project. I feel that a lot of it has to do with, we have become better staffed, and a lot of it has to do with manpower and staff. If you have a staff member that can allocate the time necessary to thoroughly go through all the documents and make sure they're crossing Ts and dotting all the Is, then you can avoid maybe some of the issues that could come up. But I feel like under all things considered, I feel like we did a good job on the project, and there were unforeseen things that we had no way to anticipate.
You can understand why they think that, though, because
Oh,
that's
yeah.
all they, they don't hear about the contracts we're under and how much and all that. Maybe we need to advertise that a little bit more too, but anyway, that was, that was a
agree.
pretty powerful number to swallow. You can understand that.
I fully understand, yes.
Councilor Doty?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think it's the compounding effects though, Rob. It's like, you can do an AI search and see what a city pool needs, and I don't want to simplify it too much or take anything away from your education or your staff's education. I think what's frustrating is like when it's lights or a rail for someone that's handicapped, those things should be caught early, right? I get a pipe under the ground that we weren't aware of. It's much easier for us to explain that, or now we do a change order because now we need a bathhouse because we have more time. It's the compounding effects. So if you do the change orders for the things that, I guess for lack of better words, are reasonable, it's why didn't we catch we needed a guardrail or a handrail? Why didn't we catch we needed lights? Do you know what I mean? So it's those things that I think, as they compound them, I've said it 4 times, I think, as they, stack on top
They
of
add
each
up.
other, it's like, but I certainly have never, I just want to make it very clear, I've never designed a pool, so I understand the frustration you're under. It's the little things that end up costing us that maybe, why wasn't it? We should always be looking at what the ADA requirements are, right? And clearly, if we're gonna use it at night, we need some lighting.
Sure,
Does
sure.
that make sense? I don't want to simplify it too
Yeah.
much, but
No, and I understand, I appreciate that, Mr. Mayor. Councilman Doty, the lighting was an interesting example. That was something that the architect completely missed. And so the contractor bid on the project. They didn't bid lights in the project because they weren't on the list of items. And so when I asked the contractor about it later, they said, you know what, even if this was in the bid, then our bid would have just been, 40,000 more. And so it's a change order because we're paying for it because the lights weren't on the project, but if they had been on there, we would have been paying for it anyway. And so it all depends on how you look at it, but I fully understand where you're coming from, and there were things that I was a little bit disappointed about in the design. Our contractor, Benetton, has done a great job, I think, and they have really tried to help us cut out things that we don't need to make sure that that we're getting the product, that we're paying for and that we're going to be happy with it. So I've been very happy with the contractor.
Councilor Dittenberg?
Mr. Mayor, Rob, can you speak to this issue? And maybe it's a perceived issue, or maybe it's a real issue, but when my business does work and does contract, both work and contracted work, there's a clause in many of the contracts that we agree to where the price is contingent upon the price of rebar and concrete at the time of the work. And I would suspect that, we're literally notified one day that the price of rebar changes in 3 days, and our cost is $25,000 over bid in 72 hours. Does that happen at the city? Does that happen a lot, I guess?
Yeah, generally our contracts are locked in. So when a contractor bids on a project, they're locked into that project. And usually there's a time frame of 4 months or 6 months that they need to complete that project within. And that's so that it doesn't drag out for 3 years and then all of a sudden, prices are 50% higher. So generally, we don't have that clause in our contracts. ITD and some of the bigger entities that do the long projects put things in like that. And that's something we could always look at, but it hasn't been a huge concern. There may be benefits to putting that in because then maybe your initial bids would come in a little lower. They're not, fluffing the numbers to make sure they can accommodate growth in materials. But right now, materials are so unpredictable, and sometimes they're up, sometimes they're down. It's hard it's hard to know where they're gonna be, but we generally have just locked a contractor into what the prices are at that time, and that's what they're stuck with.
Counselor Allgood?
Yeah, going back to the pool for a minute. So the bathhouse was a decision that we made to add on. Is there, and we've used Benetton for a lot of stuff. I understand the desire to just continue to use them in that project. Is there a requirement because of the cost of that bathhouse of any new bid, getting bids, or were we able just to let that out because they were already there?
Good question, Mr. Mayor, Councilman Allgood. The way I understand the law is that you can authorize change orders up to a significant amount if it's similar construction. And I know that the pool doesn't sound similar to the bathhouse, but in addition to the pool, they were also building another structure for the mechanical room, and so they were also already building a building. And so what we felt like in order to save costs from going back out to bid and then getting a different contractor with mobilization fees and everything, we felt like it was much more expedient to use Benetton, and we felt legally that we could do that.
Yeah, and I totally understand the expediency. I just want to make sure legally
Yeah.
we meet those standards.
And I think, I believe even at the time, that's a big addition to the scope, and I think I talked to Doug Waterman at that time, but everything that, and we've done similar things in the past on other projects, we felt like we were comfortable moving forward.
Can I get another
Yeah.
question? So, in times past, for instance, like the plaza, when we put out bids, they're not to exceed. Is that a common bid? You give us a bid, it's not to exceed?
Yeah, so there's a couple different bid methods. The pool was put out as a design bid build, which is your typical process where you hire an architect or an engineer to do the design, and then when the design's done, you take that design and you bid it out to the lowest bid, right? The plaza was a CMGC, which is a construction management general contractor process. And that's a different process where you hire the contractor earlier on, and then while you have the contractor on board, they're basically managing the construction of the project, but then you hire the architect. The architect goes through design, and while you're designing, the contractor's reviewing the design during the design process to make sure it's constructible. And then from there, once the project's designed, then the contractor gives you a not-to-exceed number, and then they guarantee they will build it within that number. And there's different circumstances where doing that process makes more sense, and then there's some where it doesn't make a lot of sense. In this case, at the plaza, it made a lot of sense because we had the refrigeration system and we had a lot of equipment that we were not super familiar with. And we wanted a contractor on board that was going to be able to review that through the design to make sure we were getting something that was constructible and functional. The downside to the CMGC is that because they have a not-to-exceed number, many times that number is going to be higher than it would be if you just did a design bid build and went with the lowest bidder. Because they know that they're committing to a number and they know that they cannot exceed that number. And so they're going to put that number where they feel like they're comfortable to make sure they can build their project with any unforeseen circumstances. And so the CMGC may come a little bit higher than a typical design bid build bid. But in some applications, it's probably the better way to go.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Mark, did you have anything that you wanted to add from? Maybe we don't want to bring you up then.
It's only like 6 slides. But I don't do them very often, so I'd appreciate it if
Yep.
you'd not be hypercritical of how it is. Just initially, Counselor Allgood, to your question about changing the scope, I have looked into that before, and Rob's right. When the change of scope is generally within sort of the understood scope of the original project, even if it wasn't part of the original contract, you can modify the contract to add that additional scope. So what you couldn't do is say to Benetton, well, hey, while you're building the pool, at Memorial Park, why don't you go build the fire station across town, right? So something that's completely, that would have to be the subject of new bidding. But you can do a modification if the project generally encompasses whatever the addition is. If that makes sense. I want to talk about construction contracting and risks, partly because I think it's sort of related, and some of the questions you're asking are sort of on point here. And so to give you some ideas about, maybe what the issues are that are out there, how they're handled from a contracting standpoint. And it's going to be a pretty high level, but it is some tools that we might be able to use in the future as a city. Some things that are a little bit different than what we've done before. I did want to address statutory requirements because those were part of what was as advertised. There are very few required statutory provisions for contracts. There's no statutory requirements for how you handle risk allocation, which is what we're going to talk about. There's no statutory requirements for how you handle change orders and who's responsible for those things. Those are all left to the general contracting between the city and the contractor. There are a few things that are required. There's some policy-driven provisions required for contracts that are completely unrelated to any of these issues, but they're requirements and they're statutory, so I thought I'd throw them in. The legislature has said we're not going to have public contracts with companies that are owned by China. We're not going to have public contracts with companies that support boycotts of Israel or support boycotts of fossil fuel industry or contracts where public dollars would go to abortion providers. And so you'll see those, I work them into the contracts simply because they're required by statute. And again, they're sort of political driven. Whether they're a good idea probably depends on your politics. Performance and payment bonds are required for public works contracting, which is really the world we're going to be in for this discussion. But again, no requirements or limits on change orders or how those are handled, and no requirements on how risk allocation is handled.
Excuse me, Mark.
Sure,
Mr.
Chuck.
Mayor. Defined risk allocation.
Coming right up. If I can. There it is. I'll start with the bottom line. Risk allocation in these contracts, it's negotiated and it's paid for. And Rob hinted at this, and I'll tell you a story. I was involved in a public works contract for the city of Lewiston as outside counsel. Lewiston has a wastewater treatment facility for its drinking water. So Caldwell draws its water out of the ground, and it comes out of the ground in pretty pristine shape. Lewiston draws its water out of the Clearwater River, and so they have a treatment facility there that treats water before it's put into their drinking water system. That was very old, some pieces of it more than 100 years old, and they were really rebuilding it from one end to the other. It was a $36 million public works contract. As we were negotiating some of the risk allocation, one of the risks right there, number 2 on the list, differing site conditions. The city was paying the contractor, it's a lot of money. It was not a lot of money. I don't think it was an unreasonable amount given the project, but I think they were paying over 6 figures for site investigation by the contractor before he started digging. And then as you read through the contract, the risk of differing site conditions was on the city. And the city, on behalf of the city, we were trying to negotiate with the contractor saying, well, look, we're paying you all this money to go out there and investigate the site before you start digging. If you miss something and all of a sudden you're surprised by the pipe that we didn't know was there, shouldn't that be on you? And the pushback was, we can talk about that, but if I'm going to assume the risk for an unknown condition, I'm not going to find everything unless you pay me $10 million to go do the site investigation, and I'll punch a hole every, foot over the entire site. And it was a complicated site. It had been there for many, many decades. There was stuff under the ground that they expected that they wouldn't know about. Records were incomplete from that age and so forth. But anyway, I use it to illustrate this point where no project goes exactly to plan. Your contractors are very savvy to this. To the extent that you just draft a contract that pushes risk onto them of all these types of risks, any of these types of risks, they're either going to walk or they're going to jack up the price. And so trying, you know, between Rob's department, my department, trying to find the balance there where you've got a contract, trying to get the best deal for the city, understanding that that doesn't mean we can just shove risk onto the contractor, because then we're gonna pay more, and if the risk doesn't materialize, the contractor makes out great and the taxpayers don't. And so a lot of times you'll see, and again, the pool situation was a little bit different, but if they had uncovered that pipe, that would have been a risk that the city would have had to take care of. But we wouldn't have put that risk on the contractor to begin with, because he'd have required us to pay for it whether it was there or not. So this is the push and pull that exists in negotiating these contracts. But those are the other kinds of things that can come up. Now, certainly some of those things might be somebody's fault, right? So if there's a delay that is the result of the contractor not appropriately scheduling his subcontractors, or if one of his subcontractors leaves him high and dry, and that creates a problem in the critical path for completion of the contract, right? That's on the contractor, and usually there's gonna be liquidated damages for that. But the weather delay is nobody's fault, right? The striking dock workers in Seattle that mean we can't get materials, that's not the city's fault, it's not the contractor's fault. Who bears that risk? Those are the kinds of things that everybody's aware of at the front end, and nobody can predict with a crystal ball. You do have a construction contingency, typically. That helps, and so you set aside some money that may or may not need to be spent. Who holds that contingency is going to be based on who holds the risk. Typically, the city has the risk for things like the unseen conditions, and the city holds that contingency. So if it's not necessary, it never gets spent. What you'll find with contractors, if they're going to hold the risk, they're going to have their own contingency. They're working into the price. Insurance, of course, bonds, you know, those things help protect certain risks, but, you know, not all of those risks that we had on the previous slide. So let's talk a little bit about delivery methods, and interrupt me with questions anytime. And Rob, if I say something wrong here, obviously interrupt me as well. Let's see. I think these slides, I thought I had something in there about design, bid, build. So delivery method, let me back up, is sort of the nature of how the contracts work together to provide for the delivery of the finished project. And so let me give you an example. Design, bid, build is the most common public works delivery method. So, and Rob's department would kind of handle this. They would have a project designed either in-house, or they would hire an engineering firm, architectural firm, to design a project, and they would get a giant stack of documents with all the specifications for the project, and then they advertise that for bids. So it's a design, then you bid it out, somebody's low bidder is awarded the contract, and they build it. I think the conventional wisdom is design, bid, build's probably going to get you the lowest bids. You're going to get the lowest bids, and part of that, I think, is I guess it's right there. It may incentivize bidders to shift risk to city. That's in the wrong place. So I've got a typo on my slide. That incentive for bidders to shift risk to the city exists not with design build, but with design bid build. So I know I'm confusing you, but in the design bid build, the contractors want to have the lowest bid. And because risk allocation equals dollars, they're probably in their proposals pushing back all this risk onto the city. The design bid build method, design build project deliveries, which one entity, the design build team, works under a single contract with the project owner to provide design and construction services. So what happens is you hire one company that's got both of those components, or maybe it's a contractor who hires out the design portion of it, but you have then a single point of responsibility. It eliminates some of the risk associated with these projects, because you don't have, in the event that you've got a contractor saying there's a design problem and a designer saying there's a construction problem, and you as a city have a contract with the designer and a contract with the contractor, the builder, and they're doing this kind of thing, that is an eliminated risk if we go with a design build format. It's a more complicated, more time consuming, probably more expensive, but it's got a great track record of delivering good projects, particularly complicated projects. I was talking with Rob before. If you were building a road section, probably not design build, because the specifications are fairly well known. Lots of contractors can do it. There's not a lot of surprises there. But if you're doing wastewater treatment, where there's lots of different options and alternatives for how you do your treatment stream, design build is a great way to go, and I think probably becoming the primary way that folks go. Rob talked a little bit about CMAR, the construction manager at risk. And again, these are ways where you have, this is one where you have a fixed price. So you hire the construction manager who kind of steps into the shoes of the city and handles the contracting, handles all of the review of what the terms are going to be. They get paid something that is established in the contract, and then there's a guaranteed maximum price. I think you mentioned the not to exceed stuff. That's what this is. And so let me shift over. The guaranteed maximum price, or not to exceed, is an open book contract. The contractor is compensated for actual costs incurred plus a fixed fee, which is limited to the maximum price. So savings resulting from unexpectedly low costs are then also returned to the city. This is a good way to go, but it does shift a lot of those risks back onto the contractor, and so don't expect that when you work toward a GMP, whether you're doing that, whether the city is doing that with a contractor, or you've hired a construction manager to bear that risk, you know, somebody's got to allocate the funds to take on that risk. And then the fixed price or lump sum is the same thing, right? You know what your cost is going to be. The difference there is it's like, what's a good example? I guess anything that you would go into the grocery store to buy a bag of potatoes. It's a fixed price. It's not going to be more, but unlike the guaranteed maximum price, you're probably not going to save if there's a way to come in underneath. I've seen that guaranteed maximum price combined with incentives, so that the fee, right, which is separate, so it's an open book contract, there's costs associated with the project, and then a fee. I've seen cities that will increase the fee to the general contractor if they can come in under budget. And so, hey, if you can figure out a way to get this done under budget, you know, we'll share that savings with you in some way. So it works the opposite of what I think, Chuck, you were questioning Ray Lynn on this business about we can't do a percentage of the fee, right? And the idea there is that the incentive, if that's the case, then the contractor's incentivized to increase the price of the project because it increases its fee. This pushes pressure the other direction. So
Mark,
again,
can
just
I interrupt
yeah,
you just for a
absolutely.
second? And I don't know whether you or Ray Lynn can answer this, but when we do the guaranteed maximum price and not to exceed, I understand that we may pay more, but in the alternative, when we budget $1 million for a project and it comes back at 1.5, then we're in a situation where we're trying to find $500,000 somewhere in the budget to make that difference. I mean, is there a, you know what I'm saying? It's, one way gives you the ability to plan ahead and budget it. The other way, I don't know, Ray Lynn, what do you think?
For the not to exceed, I see that a lot of times with designers, design contracts. I do see that where there's a not to exceed on the contract, so that because they charge hourly, so it's just based off of their hours and their time. And so on design contracts, because people will say, well, I don't know how long it'll take, and so we put a not to exceed on those contracts.
Okay, yeah, I was just trying to think from a budgetary point of view, because then we're coming back to you and saying, can you find us $250,000 somewhere to finish this kind of thing?
I think that does happen sometimes, especially with some of the change orders. The pool was kind of a special circumstance But I think it's also making sure that when we project budget, and go for the initial budget, working with Public Works to make sure that we accurately budget as well. I think prices have been changing consistently. I mean, we heard that a couple of weeks ago, like in the last 5 years, gone up 20%. And so I think that's been part of why you see an increase in change orders right now as well.
Okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, Mark. So if we had a contract similar to what the, say, the Idaho Transportation Department decides to build 4 lanes from here to Ontario, and they tell the contractor, bid on it, several bid on it, and then they say, if you come under, we'll share the cost, or we'll share the savings, or whatever, what would that be under? What classification would you use that for these various contracts?
So that would not, I mean, I think ITD, well, I know they have the authority to do a design build on some of their projects, but that would, what you're describing is kind of a 2 different ones. So the design bid build, if they design it with a private, some engineering firm, and then they solicit the bids, you could, I'm thinking, I guess you could solicit a guaranteed maximum price in those bids. And just tell the contractor that it's, whatever you bid is gonna be a guaranteed maximum price, and then you would say, to the extent that you can come in under that price, we'll share that with you. It works better, I think, to do that if you're looking at a design build, because in the design build, you've got, you don't have a price when you contract, right? Mm-hmm. So you go through a qualifications-based selection process because you don't have a design, so there's no way for them to bid, and so that would be developed in conjunction with Rob's department and potentially, city council updates. So to use your analogy, if you did it through a design build, you'd say, hey, look, we need to build the road from here to Ontario. In the design phase, you could start to look at, is there different routing, right? Can we avoid this hill? Do we really need the bridge here? Whatever, things that would affect cost. And at some point then you'd come up with, the price for the project, and then the same company is going to go build it. At that point, then you could say, and there's always 2 phases, right? There's a design phase and a construction phase. And as you shift gears to that construction phase, that's when you'd be working with them on, okay, look, if you can save money, then, we'll share it with you.
So it'd be a 2-part deal then?
A design build contract is always 2 parts. There's always
Okay.
a phase 1, and then there has to be an off ramp, right? Because if you contract with them to build it and they come in with some ridiculous price, the contract would say, we can just keep your design work and go bid it to whomever, something like that.
Okay.
If I could, just following on, there are projects for which these different delivery methods some are better and some not necessary. There is, to the extent you've got a greater degree of options, like you do in wastewater treatment, these are, I think, far superior to a design bid build. To the extent you got a more simple project, putting in playground equipment or something like that, it's probably a little bit overkill. So you'd have to, where you get me excited about these alternate delivery methods, something other than design bid build, is when you start to get a more complex project and a more expensive project.
Okay, any other questions for Mark? Okay, excellent, thank you so much,
Thanks.
Appreciate that. So I think that kind of wraps that up, in regards to that, unless there's any other questions for Rob or for...
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead,
Alright, can you-
Counselor.
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, go ahead.
Okay, so this may have been addressed. I apologize. It sounds a little bit like you guys are underwater on this program, so I couldn't hear everything that Raylan was saying. So just quickly, are we required as a city to take the lowest bid when we have a bid from a contractor? And if so, what keeps them from bidding low?
Very good, great question, that wasn't covered, so Mark is coming to the microphone to answer it.
Sure, and I'll answer it in the context of the public works construction, because I think that's most of the time where it comes up. the question of whether you do have to go with the low bidder under a traditional design bid build, and that is the delivery method that's contemplated by the statutes we're typically looking at. The disincentive for underbidding would be that they would have to do the job for that price. And the price is broken out usually into lots of different component parts so that the city can see whether there's, you know, an obvious error in how the bid was calculated and tabulated. But the risk on the contractor is, you know, they are agreeing to do the work for a certain price. There's a nuance in the law where you can pre-qualify bidders as a first step before you let them bid. And so you can have a qualifications-based selection that does not involve bidding. It just involves, you know, things like how long have they been around? What kind, have they done similar projects? What's their track record? Have they been sued? Have they ever walked off a job? And you interview folks based on those criteria, and then you can say narrow the field from 12 to 4, and then you just only those 4 can bid in the second phase. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Any other questions, Councilor Register?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate it.
You bet, for sure. What's that? Okay, Councilor Elgin.
Yeah, Mark, I have seen this a number of times in the residential section. If we hire a contractor that then hires subcontractors and they fail to pay or complete what they do to the subcontractors, do we have protection from those subcontractors coming back?
Yeah, we do. What you're referencing is the subcontractors can file a lien for the work that they've done, and the homeowner can get stuck in that position where they paid the general contractor who went off to Mexico. Now they got to pay the sub, and they're paying twice. The city's protected because one of the bonds that it's required to obtain is a payment bond, and it is specifically to cover that contingency. So there's a bond, a pool of money available to those subcontractors, and they have to file their claim with the surety company instead of some kind of a lien.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. We appreciate everyone attending this evening, and for that information, it was very helpful, Mark. So appreciate that. Okay, and that's always on our agenda. So that ends our workshop at this time.